In Washington, rumors can shift narratives within minutes. Documents can do it in seconds. At the moment, a claim is circulating rapidly across social media, cable news, and political commentary spaces that Senate Republican leadership is breaking with Donald Trump. According to the claim, a private meeting triggered a sudden internal revolt, and the vote count is already approaching the threshold needed to block or significantly constrain administration priorities. The problem with this story is not that it is necessarily false. The problem is how quickly speculation becomes treated as fact. A closed-door meeting becomes evidence of a coup. A single post becomes confirmation. A repost becomes verification. By the time anyone asks for documentation, the narrative has already hardened into accepted reality. In practice, developments like this are almost always far more complex. They are usually a combination of partial signals, strategic leaks, internal positioning, and heavy layers of interpretation. The truth tends to move slowly. Outrage moves fast. This analysis takes a different approach. Rather than amplifying speculation, it separates what is confirmed from what remains unverified, explains how stories like this spread so rapidly, and identifies the specific indicators that would determine whether this claim collapses or becomes a documented political event in the next several days. Defining the core claim. Before assessing credibility, the claim must be defined precisely, without repeating it as fact. The assertion is that senior Senate Republican leaders have privately decided to oppose or constrain a Trump-backed initiative. The claim further suggests that this opposition has either reached or is close to reaching a numerically meaningful threshold, enough votes to block, delay, or materially reshape the administration's agenda through Senate procedure. That is the claim. Nothing more, nothing less. What counts as confirmation? A claim of this magnitude should only be treated as confirmed if it meets at least one of the following standards: public documentation, a signed letter, official statement, or formal release with identifiable names attached; named public statements, on-the-record comments from senators or leadership offices through verified channels, including press releases, interviews, or official social media accounts; legislative record evidence, observable actions on Congress.gov, such as filed amendments, procedural objections, changes in scheduling, or recorded votes; top-tier reporting with attribution; coverage that cites named officials or specific documents that can be independently cross-checked, not anonymous sourcing alone. Without at least one of these elements, a claim remains unverified. What is typically unconfirmed in viral versions. By contrast, the following elements commonly appear in viral narratives but do not meet verification standards: exact vote counts, presented as certainty without names attached; detailed descriptions of private meetings without recordings or contemporaneous documentation; references to leaked audio or messages that are not publicly available; claims about donor threats, ultimatums, or private conversations that cannot be independently verified. Descriptions of evidence are not the same as evidence itself. Until documentation is produced, these remain claims, not facts. How these stories spread. The trajectory of this story follows a familiar pattern in Washington. First, a claim appears framed as insider certainty, using language that implies inevitability and urgency. Second, high-visibility accounts amplify it because certainty and drama outperform nuance and engagement metrics. Third, repetition turns the claim into a presumed event, even though the public record has not changed. Finally, pundit discussions analyze implications rather than verification, cementing the narrative through repetition. The most important question is therefore not who is talking about the claim, but what the earliest verifiable source is. The truth is usually found in one quiet place: the record. How Senate revolts actually happen. Real leadership resistance in the U.S. Senate rarely begins with dramatic announcements. It starts with procedural friction. Votes are not scheduled. Unanimous consent is denied. Debate time is extended. Amendments alter substance. Committees slow cooperation. The math quietly fails. Senate power is structural and often invisible. What does not happen matters more than what does. Most internal conflicts are not driven by ideology or loyalty, but by risk calculation. Senators assess electoral exposure, donor reactions, legal implications, and long-term political liability. These considerations, not public allegiance, are what ultimately move votes. Incentives. Behind the narrative, three incentive engines typically drive stories like this. Political leverage leaks can be used to create momentum or generate caution. Apparent inevitability pressures holdouts, while perceived risk discourages action. Media economics. Procedural ambiguity does not trend. Conflict does. Dramatic framing spreads faster regardless of accuracy. Institutional survival senators prioritize protecting seats and party viability. When association with chaos becomes risky, distance becomes rational. Understanding these incentives clarifies why even unproven claims can have real-world effects. Why verification matters. Whether the claim is true or not, its spread produces immediate consequences. Public trust erodes as citizens lose confidence in their ability to discern reality. Governance slows as negotiations become more cautious and contested. Institutional credibility weakens as allies and adversaries question stability and reliability. Repeated claims become belief. Belief becomes political reality. Political reality reshapes outcomes, even if the original claim was exaggerated or strategically planted. Possible outcomes. 3 scenarios now exist. Scenario 1. Collapse under scrutiny. No documentation emerges. No named confirmations appear. Reputable outlets walk back the claim. Result, the story fades, but the initial damage remains. Scenario 2. Slow procedural resistance, mixed signals persist. Some senators express concerns. Leadership hedges publicly while quietly slowing action. Result, prolonged ambiguity with no definitive resolution. Scenario 3. Formal rupture. Signed letters, documented procedural blocks, public leadership opposition, or decisive votes occur. Result, the story becomes historical fact and demands substantive analysis rather than verification. What to watch. Before accepting any version of this story, track the following. Is there an original document? Are there named, on-the-record confirmations? Do legislative records reflect resistance? Are top-tier outlets citing verifiable sources? Are corrections issued if claims prove inaccurate? The credibility of any outlet is measured not by how fast it amplifies a claim, but by how transparently it corrects errors. Why silence matters more than statements. One of the most misunderstood signals in Washington is silence. In high-stakes political conflicts, what leaders do not say often matters more than what they say publicly. If Senate leadership were preparing a genuine break, there would typically be one of 2 patterns. Coordinated ambiguity, where multiple figures use carefully aligned language that avoids commitment while signaling distance. Deliberate quiet, where leadership allows procedural actions to speak instead of statements. However, prolonged silence without accompanying procedural movement usually indicates that negotiations are still internal, unresolved, or deliberately being kept below the threshold of public commitment. Silence alone is not confirmation. It only becomes meaningful when paired with action in the legislative record. Timing and the 24 to 72-hour window claims like this tend to resolve or collapse within a short time frame. The reason is structural. If leadership truly has the numbers to block an initiative, delay becomes costly. Momentum must be converted into leverage before it dissipates. Conversely, if the claim is exaggerated, time works against it. The longer no documentation appears, the weaker the claim becomes. This is why the next 24 to 72 hours are critical. During this window, one of 3 things usually happens. A document surfaces, procedural resistance becomes visible, or the narrative quietly dissolves as attention shifts elsewhere. Absent one of the first two, credibility declines rapidly. The role of anonymous sources. Anonymous sourcing is not inherently illegitimate. It is often necessary. However, it must be handled with discipline. Reliable reporting typically uses anonymity to protect individuals, not to substitute for evidence. When multiple anonymous sources are cited, their claims should still be anchored to verifiable facts, documents, votes, filings, or observable behavior. When anonymity becomes the entire foundation of a story, without any public-facing corroboration, it signals that the information is either incomplete, strategically leaked, or still being tested by its originators. Why early certainty is a red flag. One consistent indicator of weak claims is excessive confidence at an early stage. Political outcomes involving dozens of independent actors rarely resolve cleanly or instantly. Language such as "it's over," "the votes are locked," or "leadership has already decided" should trigger skepticism unless accompanied by proof. In Washington, certainty without documentation is often persuasion, not reporting. How leaders signal without committing. When leaders want to apply pressure without formalizing opposition, they often rely on indirect signals, allowing critical comments from allies without correction, delaying scheduling decisions, using non-committal phrasing that emphasizes process, review, or ongoing discussions. These signals create space for adjustment. They are tools of negotiation, not declarations of rupture. The difference between resistance and rebellion. It is also important to distinguish between resistance and rebellion. Resistance is common. It involves bargaining, delay, and modification. Rebellion is rare. It involves public alignment against leadership, documented votes, and acceptance of political consequences. Most viral narratives confuse the two. They interpret early resistance as evidence of rebellion, even though the institutional incentives strongly favor gradualism over confrontation. Why corrections rarely travel as far. When claims are overstated or incorrect, corrections almost always receive less attention. This asymmetry is structural, not accidental. Outrage spreads because it is emotionally efficient. Corrections require attention, context, and trust. As a result, misinformation can shape public perception even after being disproven. This is why initial restraint matters. The cost of being wrong early is far higher than the cost of being late, but accurate. What responsible interpretation looks like. A responsible approach does not require cynicism or blind trust. It requires proportional confidence. At this stage, the appropriate position is neither full acceptance nor outright dismissal. It is conditional assessment. If documentation emerges, revise conclusions accordingly. If procedural resistance becomes visible, acknowledge partial confirmation. If neither occurs, downgrade the claim. This approach preserves credibility and keeps analysis aligned with reality rather than momentum. Final perspective. Political systems do not usually change direction in a single meeting or leak. They change through accumulation, documents, actions, votes, and consequences. The purpose of verification is not to slow understanding, but to prevent confusion from masquerading as insight. When analysis waits for evidence, it may arrive later, but it arrives intact. Until the record speaks, the claim remains exactly what it is, a possibility, not a fact.